I give great concern and careful evaluation and deliberate consideration, and especially to Senate Bill 1062. I call them like I see them, despite the cheers or the boos from the crowd. I took the necessary time to make the right decision. As governor, I have asked questions and I have listened. I have protected religious freedoms when there is a specific and present concern that exists in our state, and I have a record to prove it.
Even as Governor Jan Brewer is trying to put SB 1062 behind the times in Arizona, other states are currently considering similar legislation, including Georgia, Mississippi, and Utah. Joining me now, Richard Wolff, the executive editor of MSNBC.com, and Josh Barro, an MSNBC contributor. Richard, the politics of this for Governor Brewer, you could almost read between the lines of that statement. Very, very well, carefully written statement that included a careful message to Brewer's hardcore supporters who would support this kind of legislation.
Sure. Arizona is a state in flux. It's not a coincidence that in 08 and 12, the Obama campaigns in those years looked very closely at the end about putting extra money in because they thought Arizona might just be gettable. Is Arizona more like Utah or is it more like New Mexico? And it's a country, it's a country that's in flux, and this is a state that's in flux. And she's trying to bridge both of these things. She's not the world's most skillful politician, but actually she was quite artful tonight. And I think there is some part of the Arizona political brain here that's working overtime saying, how can I bridge this divide? This isn't the Deep South. It's not like my state is moving and the country's moving in a different direction. Arizona's moving where the rest of the country is. How can you keep the old political blocks together? She wrestled with that in public today.
Josh Barro, we have seen Republican-controlled legislatures around the country seeming to work from the same playbook on voting rights issues, on cracking down on public employee labor unions, that sort of thing. Is this one of those? What's happening in other states on this kind of legislation?
Well, I think what we're going to see in other states is people learning from this Arizona experience. I think what you saw a real national push in the Republican Party to try to kill this move, because what Republicans were really afraid of was that in the case of Arizona, opponents of this law would bring a ballot initiative and have a fight in November over repealing this law. It would energize Democratic voters. It would bring money into the state, possibly jeopardize the Republicans holding on to the governorship in the election this year. And I think Republicans in other states will look at this similarly, say, we don't want to draw attention to ourselves. There's no upside in this, as we saw from Arizona. So I think, you have these bills pending in state legislatures, but I think Republicans do learn from each other in state-to-state governments, and what they're learning here is this is a fight they don't feel like picking. Andrea
Mitchell had a very important live interview with the Secretary of State today in her hour, and she had a lot of important ground to cover from Ukraine to Syria, and this came up. Let's listen to how it came up.
Doesn't it undercut our moral posture telling Uganda and other countries, Putin, for instance, on human rights abuses against people for reasons of their sexuality, when one of our states is about to do this unless it's vetoed by the governor?
Well, let's see whether the governor vetoes it. I'm counting on the governor. I cannot imagine how that law would withstand the scrutiny of the Supreme Court of the United States. So I would hope that she'll make the right decision.
Well, the governor did stop it as of tonight, but Andrew's got a really good point. We have heard Putin and other Russian officials completely get it wrong about what's going on in this country on these kinds of things, but they're using these little germs like this and turning them into something that isn't there because the Republican legislatures are giving them these kinds of things.
We are. It's a big country, and there are lots of different pieces that maybe people who are more skeptical or even opposing America's interests around the world can pick and cherry pick what they want. Having said that, just take Western Europe. America's way out ahead of even countries that might be considered more forward-leaning and progressive, at least socially. You have Spain, a Catholic conservative country, voting for same-sex marriage ahead of the UK, which might consider itself more international. Yeah. These are unpredictable flows in social culture and change, and America is way out ahead of many other countries that like to think of themselves as very contemporary. So Russia can do what it likes. We're not talking about the religious conflicts that are playing out through Ugandan politics and African politics in general. There's a lot to be proud of in what this country has done for equal rights, specifically around same-sex and LGBT issues. Yes, there are parts of the country that have still got a journey to travel, but I don't think John Kerry's going to have a difficulty in explaining America's position when it comes to equal rights.
Josh Barro, these things get pushed in the Republican legislatures by the Ted Cruz wing of Republicanism, which is, number one, we don't care about the party. Number two, we just want to cast this vote. We don't care. We'd like to win, but if we don't win, it's important for us to cast this vote saying we want this. How is anyone going to be able to suppress that in Republican legislature?
Well, I think it's happened in Arizona right now, and I think you're seeing in Ohio the bill that was proposed has been withdrawn by its sponsors. There are certain things that have tremendous grassroots energy behind them on the right, where there is resistance when you have elite forces like you saw here, business groups, certain national politicians like Mitt Romney trying to push the party to the center on this issue. In some cases, you get a lot of pushback. You didn't really see that here. I think that actually is not a hobby horse
that's a good point.
that the party is going to cling to, and I think there's a real distinction to be drawn in Arizona. People look at this and they look at SB 1070, the very tough anti-immigration bill that Governor Brewer had signed a few years ago, and sort of say, well, why did she veto this and sign that and side with her base there? The difference is that SB 1070 was and is popular in Arizona. That was a shrewd political move by Brewer, who I actually think has been a real survivor, made a lot of very smart political choices, and held on to a governorship that she probably should have lost in 2010. Most people wouldn't have been able to thread the needles she did. In this case, she was making a move that was both correct on the policy merits and also popular. People in Arizona wanted her to veto this bill, and she did.
And you talk about the pushback from Republicans against a veto. The most prominent Republicans we were hearing from in Arizona were the senators who wanted the veto and those three Republicans who voted for it and changed their minds. I didn't hear.
They just wanted it to go away.
Yeah.
This is not something where you have a really vocal portion of the party that, like Ted Cruz, is willing to die on this hill. There are certainly some, but it's not going to drive the party in the way that the government should.
This only came up because people paid attention. In another kind of politics, even a couple of years ago, without social media, without our attention, honestly, that had gotten away with it and said, check the box, the base is happy, and no one would have paid attention.
They got away with it until we focused on it, we, the national media. Richard Wolff and Josh Barro, thank you both very much for joining me tonight.